Hey guys, so chapter two from The Meaning of Jesus' Two Visions. Now, this is by N.T. Wright, and although you don't see a lot of organized structure in this chapter, rest assured that it's there. So don't. I know this is kind of the hardest chapter that we've done so far. He uses a lot of larger words. He uses a lot of metaphors that are a little bit hard to understand. You have to look up some words actually in this chapter from a dictionary. So I will do my best to walk through chapter two with you. This might take about 30 minutes or so. So have your book in front of you and remember the three questions that we are trying to ask. So, number one, what is the essential question? Number two, what is his thesis? And then number three, what is the method? How does N.T. Wright go about making his argument? So you remember the essential question from this unit. The essential question is a question of epistemology. How do we know? Specifically, how do we know about Jesus? Now, a couple of things to pay attention when you read. Look at the title of the chapter, Knowing Jesus, Faith, and History. He's already giving you a clue as to what he's going to be arguing. And then look at his opening line. Here, he's being very explicit in telling you what his thesis is. He says, we know about Jesus in two ways, faith and history. So notice here he says we know about Jesus. That is going to change slightly as we come towards the end of the chapter, and I'll unpack once we get there. So here, the essential question, how do we know? Well, he gives you his thesis right here. We know about Jesus through history and faith. Now, I want to unpack what he's doing here in this opening section. He says people regularly try to eliminate one on the basis of another, dismissing combinations as compromise. He says this separation belongs to the Western world of the last 3 centuries. So in the same way that Marcus Borg talked about the Enlightenment, so too does N.T. Wright. He says it goes with the split of religion and politics. Okay, you guys have kind of lived in a time where religion and everything else is split. Specifically, you guys probably know there is in America a split between science on the one hand over here and religion on the other hand over here. So he's saying that we live in a time, ever since the Enlightenment, where people have had a split, I'm trying to draw a line right between these two, between history and faith. And he says that this separation belongs to the Western world of the last 3 centuries. It goes with the split of religion and politics, with the dismissal of God into a remote deist heaven. You need to maybe look up what deism means, leaving humans to organize the world as they please, and with the definition of religion as that which humans do in their solitude. So here he's going to go on, and so I hope that makes sense. That his opening line, his opening argument is that we have lived in a time over the last 300 years where religion over here and history, to use his phrase, history he really is meaning politics, science, academia on this side. And he's saying, like Marcus, I grew up with the split implicit in my worldview. One used a different voice or tone of voice for God, and even for Jesus. As so fascinated as I was about history, he said, when I first studied the New Testament, the closest I got to integrating the two worlds. Now ask yourself, what two worlds? Well, the worlds of history and faith. Was when St. Paul, which we've already talked about, appealed to the Emperor Nero. We've also already talked about. In other words, in his life, he was raised in a time period where you separated the two. You separated history from faith, or you separated faith from history. Now, in my own life, I can speak personally. When I went off to college, in particular when I went off to graduate school to study religion, the leaders of my church back in Colorado said, you should not go and study in the academy because you will lose your faith. Now listen to that. You should not study in the academy because you will lose your faith. And what they were saying is we believe that there ought to be a split between history and between faith. And that's what N.T. Wright is saying. He was raised in a climate where there was a split between history on the one hand and faith on the other. So think for a second. Is he going to be okay with that split? So he goes on to talk about his historical learning. He was N.T. Wright was a historian before he became a theologian, and he's talking again. This is tough for language here. He's talking about reading about the Dead Sea Scrolls, about these early Christian communities. And he says, at every point in this reading, I found material that illuminated Jesus and the texts that spoke about him. At no point did I detect the familiar split between history and faith. In other words, in his academic discourse of history, he never experienced the split between history and faith. And he says it took some years and various crises. Exegesis is a really fancy word that theologians use to talk about biblical interpretation. So he says it took some years and various crises, exegetical and personal, to show me that this integrated world of faith, of history and faith, was more true to the rest of human life, including my own, than I dare suppose. Okay, so step back for a second. What's he saying? Notice what he says right here. His growing up kind of led me, he said, in other words, first to name and then to rebel against this is again great N.T. Wright language, against the tyrannical thought forms in whose split level world I had grown up. Led me into fresh epistemological, remember epistemology is the question of knowledge, how do we know? Fresh epistemological air and the new risky choices of a single world with multiple interlocking dimensions. Okay, try to visualize this. I've kind of divided the screen in two. What he's saying is, in his academic study of religion, and over his kind of growing up years, he initially started with a split between history and faith. Okay, right here. But he said the more he studied, the more he wanted to name and then rebel against the strong language, tyrannical thought forms in whose split level world I had grown up. In other words, he wanted to rebel against this divide, this split between history and religion and history and faith. And he wanted to obliterate this line and combine both of these disciplines together. In other words, he does not think that they should be separated. Okay, does that make sense to you? He does not want to look at history only from the lens of faith and only from the lens of history. When I was a little kid, I know that the technology has changed this, but if ever I went to a 3D movie, the glasses back then had one lens that was blue and one lens that was red. Okay, let me try to use that analogy. If, for example, when N.T. Wright was being raised, he was taught to have a split world view when it came to Jesus. So in order to look at Jesus, you only have to wear the red goggles, the red glasses to see Jesus of faith. And you only had to wear the blue glasses, the blue lenses to see the Jesus of history. Okay, I hope this is making sense. And he wants in his academic work to rebel against that you have only the lenses of faith or only the lenses of history. He wants, as the 3D glasses that I was raised on, to have a blue lens and a red lens, one blue in one eye and one red in the other eye. And it's that mixture of these two disciplines that allows one to see and therefore to know, again, this fresh epistemological air, the real world. The real world is not this easy divide. So he says, and look at this, he says, I regard this as the most liberating moment of my intellectual development. In my own personal life, I would agree with that statement. This move, because I've gone through this too, this move is one of the most liberating moments of my intellectual career. He says, I react against the attempts to pull me back into the old split level world. Attempts made, of course, from both levels, with the vigor of one who does not want to be imprisoned again in the attic or in the dungeon. Okay, so now he's using a house metaphor. He's saying that in the split level world, it is much like a house where faith is kind of divorced from history, and this is religion in the attic of the house. Then you have in the dungeon history divorced from faith. Okay, do you see how he's using these two terms? Faith on the one hand, history on the other. He doesn't want them to be separated. Okay, so how does N.T. Wright say we know Jesus? Well, we don't look at Jesus only through the lens of history. Okay, we'll get an incomplete picture. We don't look at Jesus only through the lens from faith, because again, we will get an incomplete picture. So now he's starting to unpack what he means when he says that we know about Jesus through history and faith. So you already know what he's going to be talking about in this chapter. He's going to be talking about history on the one hand and faith on the other. This word right here, we need to define that, a priori. You need to maybe look that up. So a priori essentially means prior to experience. Okay, it's a philosophical term that philosophers and theologians use, talking about prior to experience. So let me ask you a question. Do you judge people prior to experiencing them? Okay, do you judge books prior to reading them? And the answer to that is an emphatic yes. We all do. Now notice what he's saying here though. All historians have theological religious presuppositions. Atheists, as well as people of faith, we've made up our minds prior to looking at the material. Okay, we make up our minds prior to looking at the data. So he goes on to say that history is precisely looking through one's own spectacles, one's own lenses. Marcus Borg said this too, didn't he? At the evidence about the past. Okay, so this is the task of the historian. To look through one's own spectacles at the evidence about the past, trying to reconstruct probable course of events and the motivations of the characters involved, defending such reconstructions against rival ones. Now listen to this, not on their grounds with their own presuppositions, but on the scientific grounds of getting in the data, and doing so with appropriate simplicity and shedding light on other areas of research. In other words, the task that is before us is to look at the Gospels and not try to make everything in the Gospels line up with our own presuppositions. Okay, this is pretty good. Not make everything in the Gospels line up with our own presuppositions, but allow the Gospels to speak for themselves. Okay? Not on the grounds of their coherence, he says, with our presuppositions, but on the scientific grounds of getting in the data and really shedding light on the areas of research. Here are a few more things that we need to look up. He says, my view that we come to know Jesus by both history and faith is itself a product of a lifelong attempt to do just this, which I believe to have been sufficiently successful to encourage me to press on. So listen to what he says though. He says, when during this attempt I have found from time to time that the Jesus I knew by faith seemed less and less like the Jesus I was discovering by history. I have found that by living with the problem, turning it this way and that in the complex and often hidden world of personal and communal consciousness and reflection, faith has been able to discover not just that the new and initially surprising historical evidence was capable of being accommodated, but also that it could actually be turned to advantage. Again, go back to this house metaphor. If faith is in the attic and history is only in the dungeon, they never interact. But if you bring them down into the house, they interact. Uh, and sometimes the house can get messy. But guys, you're mature enough for this, so I'll tell you honestly. Academic learning and academic discourse is messy. It's hard. Learning to think academically is not easy. And that's what he wants us to do. He doesn't want us to resort to just easy understandings of Jesus, but he wants us to deal with the true Jesus as he was as a historical person and to live with the tension of faith and history. If you listen to Dr. Bird, he will often say that we need to live within the tension of reason and of faith. And that is exactly what N.T. Wright is saying here. So here, now, again, this is going to be an attack against Marcus Borg. Okay, it's a very subtle attack, but you need to understand it. And you need to look up a couple words. Hermeneutic. Okay, you need to look up the word hermeneutic. I'll tell you what it means, but it would be best if you look it up. He says, part of the challenge of history comes from allowing suspicion a proper role. Okay, how suspicious are you when a friend is telling you a story about somebody? How suspicious are you when you hear, some news story of whatever it may be? And think to yourself for just a second, how suspicious does N.T. Wright think Marcus Borg is when it comes to the New Testament? Suspicion, he says, of the texts themselves, of one's own colleagues' reading, and particular of one's own. However, a caution is necessary. The Guild of New Testament Studies has become so used to operating with a hermeneutic of suspicion that we often find ourselves trapped in our own subtleties. Okay, this word, hermeneutic. Hermeneutic is another term that philosophers and theologians in particular use to talk about interpretation. You and I have different hermeneutical perspectives. You and I interpret the Bible slightly differently. Okay? And what he's saying here, and man, read this, read it 2 or 3 times, because you'll need to know what he's saying. And again, this is kind of a slight jab at Marcus Borg. He's saying there is a guild of New Testament studies. So a section of New Testament theologians today who have become so used to operating with an interpretation of suspicion. Okay, they are suspicious of things whenever they are reading the Bible, especially the New Testament. These are the people that say, maybe Jesus didn't turn water into wine at the wedding in Cana, like Marcus Borg said. These are the people, again, like Marcus Borg, who says, maybe Jesus didn't say, I am the light of the world. So N.T. Wright is saying we need to not, please note that, we need to not have a hermeneutic of suspicion. Down here, he says suspicion is all very well. There is also such a thing as a hermeneutic of paranoia. So Marcus, or N.T. Wright, forgive me, is rebelling against some, not all, but some of the New Testament scholars today who he says are operating with a hermeneutic, an interpretation of suspicion, a suspicious interpretation of the New Testament. So what does he propose? This phrase right here, no holds barred. I actually had to look this one up a year ago. A no holds barred is a phrase coming from wrestling that talks about basically no holds are barred, are illegal in a wrestling match. So he says, therefore, I propose a no holds barred history on the one hand, and a no holds barred faith on the other. This, he says, I believe, is to live in the uncomfortable real world, where such things do not shout challenges at each other from behind locked doors, but meet, merge, fuse, question each other uncouple again, swirl around each other, undergird and undermine each other, examine each other's foundations, and set about demolishing and reconstructing them, appearing at the one moment inseparable and at the next embarrassingly as a public family squabble. Okay, so what are the two things he's talking about here? Well, history and faith. Answer yourself this question. Does N.T. Wright want us to separate history from faith? No, 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 no. He wants us to combine them in a very messy, real world, mature academic discourse. Okay? This is all still a part of his introduction. So, where is he going to begin? History. I'm going to speed up here a little bit. What is it the history or historians want? They want evidence. If it's evidence, he says, we want it. And so what is our task that is before us as good historians or as learning people or people who are learning to be historians? Well, we need to do our best to know what kind of world was Jesus from? So the historian of Jesus, using all available material and coveting more, will try to ask questions such as, what can be known about Jesus? Where does he belong within the world of his day? The Greco-Roman world of early antiquity, and of the first century Judaism in particular. What were his aims? To what extent did he accomplish them? What caused him to meet an early death? And, not least, why did a movement claiming allegiance to him spring up shortly after his death? So notice here, the questions are deeper perhaps than what you and I have often thought. Remember how Marcus Borg began that first chapter with these very simple answers about Jesus that society has given. Now, these questions do not elicit simple answers. Because that's why I think that this class is so fun, because we actually get to dive down into the deep and the difficult questions and answers. So I promise a couple pain in the brains along the way. I promise that you will think of some things that you've never thought of. But I really hope to convey, and I will try as best as I can to do this, that is good. Thinking about these things, whether you're a Christian or whether you are not a Christian, is a good thing. This is what it means to be a mature academic person, to think, to learn, and to examine. So again, we are now talking about history. This is pretty straightforward. He's talking a little bit about what our sources are. The available sources do not offer us a coherent picture of Jesus. Keep reading when you are doing this on your own. And again, he's talking about the synoptic gospels. He's talking about Q. He's talking about the shaping of pre-literary oral traditions. And then those oral traditions were collected into literary sources. And then number 3, those collections were edited into literary sources, into public gospels. This is the 3-step process of how we got the New Testament. Again, we've already talked about this, so this should make quite a bit of sense. Here again, much like what Marcus Borg did, he's talking about the claims. What do we say about Q? What do we say about the first letters? That is fairly straightforward. And again, a lot of the stuff about history, Q, dealing with John the Baptist. This stuff is fairly straightforward. We will talk a little bit about this in class, but not a ton. So I want to move on to the last little bit of this section before he goes into his discussion on faith. Again, this is the task that is before us as historians. And notice here when he's talking in this paragraph, he's bringing up pre-Easter, post-Easter, and I want to pick up. Let's start right here. So this, and again, I'm assuming you've already read this. So this, of course, is done particularly by those who still wedded to the old liberal picture of Jesus as teacher, who, unlike several leaders of the first century Jewish movement, would have been shocked to think of Jesus as, for instance, the Messiah. So he says, I do not know in advance, more specifically, that a considerable gulf exists between Jesus as he was, okay, the pre-Easter Jesus that Marcus Borg says, and Jesus as the church came to know him and speak of him, the post-Easter Jesus. We might eventually wish to reach some source or some such conclusion. We cannot build it into our historical method. Again, these two scholars, although they are friends, they are arguing against each other because they are trying to propose their own version of what the best picture of the historical Jesus is. This is a really good paragraph. Really pay attention here. I like how he says this is regularly described in terms borrowed from the ordinary interpersonal relationships. Believers are aware of Jesus' presence, his love, his guidance, his consolation, his rebuke, and even perhaps his laughter. They are aware of being in touch with his personality that is recognizable, distinct, frequently puzzling, and unpredictable, always loving, lovable, powerful and empowering, loyal and calling forth loyalty. What is he saying here? And I should have underlined this, so forgive me. Here he's going on to his next section. So much for history. He says, what can we say about faith itself? Remember, what type of faith does he want? He wants a no holds barred Christian faith. So really, be sure that you understand what he's talking about here. Faith, he's going to say, is something that the believer claims to know Christ. So let's go back. What is the task of history? Well, the task of history is to know about Jesus. But the task of faith is to actually know Jesus. And so what I read here earlier, knowing is what he's going to bring up later on. But look at all of these phrases. This is what it means to know Jesus for N.T. Wright. To know of his presence, his love, his guidance, his consolation, rebuke, his laughter. This is the task of faith for N.T. Wright. Again, a devout leader in the Church of England. So he's talked about history. What does it mean to know or to know about Jesus? How do we know about Jesus? And then now he's going to say so much for history. Now on to the second part of the chapter. What do we say about faith? The goal of faith, please get this, is to know Christ, to know Jesus. So at the same time, with any relationships, there are problems, there are misunderstandings, and there are difficulties. And so here, almost all Christians report experiencing from time to time a sense of distance or even the apparent withdrawal of Jesus' presence. Christian teachers and spiritual directors have long recognized that this may happen through one of or a combination of various factors, including depression, tiredness, rebellion, sin, misinformation, wrong expectations, and many others. Equally, he says, they may happen for none of these reasons, and there may be times when all one can do is to wait in the darkness. But after the waiting, again and again comes a fresh knowledge. Granted, by the way the English language works, one cannot call it anything else. So here, this knowledge, he's going to unpack, what does this mean? So what does it mean to know? Again, I told you he's going to unpack that. Here he goes. What does it mean to know someone? Human beings, he says, or humans being what they are, this is a great mystery. It is clearly different from knowing about them. Okay? When I'm recording this at home and my wife is in the other room. I can know a lot about my wife. Okay, but what's odd is that I will never know everything about her. So I can know about her, but being in a relationship necessarily presupposes that I actually know her. So when we know a person, as opposed to, say, knowing the height of the Eiffel Tower, it implies some kind of relationship, some mutual understanding. Okay, does that make sense? Yes, I know about my wife. I know her birth date. I know what high school she went to. I know where she works. I know her height. I know she's about to have a baby. I know a lot about my wife. But that is, according to N.T. Wright, the task of history. The task of faith is to actually know someone. So he says we could perhaps arrive at the basic facts by careful, detached study. But when we say we know someone, okay, when we say we know someone, we assume that this knowledge is the result of a face-to-face encounter. Okay, I don't know just about my wife. I actually know her. So when someone claims to know Jesus in this sense, they're making claims of other things as well. The existence of a non-spatio-temporal world. You might need to look that up. A lot of people call this heaven. The existence of Jesus within that world, and the possibility of presently alive human beings having access to that world, and this being actually true in their case. Okay, so again, what's the goal of this page? We're talking about what does it mean to know somebody. This knowledge is what many people, myself included, refer to when they say that we know Jesus by faith. Okay, this chapter is not as hard as it looked at the very beginning. Again, how do we know about Jesus? Oh, we know about Jesus through history, but we know Jesus through faith. So, and in that knowledge, we come to know about him. Okay, does that make sense? In the context of personal relationships, we come to, or we discover more about who Jesus is, what he is like, and what gladdens him, and what grieves him, what he longs for, laughs at, and what he offers, and what he challenges people to do. One of the really cool things about being married is the more I know my wife, the more I learn about her. Uh, that's his argument here. The more one knows Jesus, the more one knows about him. And so it's kind of a pattern. If you know more about somebody, well, then you know them because you experience them. And when you experience them, you know them. Another wife example, sorry, there's a lot of them. It's going to be very interesting how she and I approach having a new baby in the house. Um, that is going to be something that we're going to learn about each other. How does one react? Well, that lesson that we're going to learn is going to be learned as we know how the other person reacts. So that is essentially his argument here. In knowing somebody, we also know more about them. So here he's acknowledging, he says, in saying this, I open myself, of course, to the full hermeneutical, what does that word mean again? Fury of the modernist, who says, I have renounced objectivity. And the postmodernist, we can talk about these terms in class if you need to, who says it's all wish fulfillment. He's acknowledging that he's taking a leap of faith here by saying the goal of religious studies is not simply to know Jesus. Or sorry, forgive me. The goal of religious studies is not simply to know about Jesus. But the goal of religious studies for N.T. Wright is to actually know Jesus. It includes both knowing him and knowing about him. Listen to this. This is a really good paragraph. You need to look up one more word before we're done. History, he says, then prevents faith from becoming fantasy. Do you know any people, and you don't need to make fun of them, but do you know any people who their faith is somewhat divorced from history? They just live on this barrier. Oops, that's not supposed to happen. They live on this divide. They live on the faith side. And they kind of live in la la land a little bit. They just live in this fantasy world. Does N.T. Wright want that? No. No, no, no. So he says history prevents faith from becoming fantasy. When I was a little boy at my church, every summer, for some reason, we had a hot air balloon in the church parking lot. And um, and what was interesting, well, I don't know if it was interesting, the hot air balloon was always tethered to the ground. So they would put some of the hot air in the hot air balloon. We'd go up about 100 feet, and the tethering kept the hot air balloon somewhat grounded. And that's what he's saying here about history. History prevents faith from becoming fantasy. In other words, history grounds faith. How many people, how many of you guys don't like history? If you don't like history, I beg you to reconsider. But a lot of you guys don't like history because it's boring. Look at this word. You need to look it up. Antiquarian. He says faith prevents history from becoming mere antiquarianism. The root word here is not anti. The root word comes from the word antique, meaning old, or antiquity, meaning of ancient times. So he says faith prevents history from becoming mere antiquarianism, mere boring, flat history. The way I would rephrase this by saying, faith brings history alive. And so go back to his thesis. We know about Jesus through history and faith. Is that his thesis? That we know about Jesus through history and faith? Or his thesis that is his thesis that we know Jesus through history and faith? History prevents faith from becoming fantasy. Faith prevents history from becoming flat and boring and kind of stupid. And so he's going to use this as a launching point for the rest of his argument. But let's go back. What is the essential question? How do we know about Jesus? What is his thesis? Or let me rephrase the essential question. Sorry. How do we know Jesus? His thesis? We know Jesus through history and faith. Does he want those two separated? Like the Western world has done for the last 300 years? No. He wants them to be united in the very rough and tumble, difficult world of academic religious discourse. Okay, he doesn't want us to just know about Jesus. He wants us to take the leap of faith. So he says right here, history and faith. Okay, they need each other at every step, and never more so than here. Okay, this inclines me to suppose that the category of knowledge itself is actually a branch of another category. That, as in such of the Hebrew scriptures, knowing is a part of loving, rather than the other way around. Okay, I hope this really helped out. Again, the essential question, how do we know Jesus? The thesis, we know Jesus through faith and history. His method is really quite simple. He begins by talking about how they've been separated for 300 years. Should they be separated? No. He wants to name and rebel against the separation. Why should they not be separated? What is the task of what is the task of suspicion? And then he talks about history. What is the task of the historian? Moves on to faith. What is the task of faith? What is the goal? And he concludes, he wants to bring them together in a rough and tumble world. And I really hope that this has helped you out.